It is. Hello, everyone. Thanks for watching. I'm David Hopper, Austin Bureau Chief of the music site 360degreesound.com. Today, I'm joined by Nicole London, the co-director of the new documentary film We Want the Funk. Nicole is an Emmy Award-winning and Grammy-nominated producer and director. She was associate producer for American Masters, Marvin Gaye, What's Going On, and Sammy Davis Jr., I've Gotta Be Me, among other films. We Want the Funk, which premiered on PBS's Independent Lens on April 8th, examines the symbiotic relationship between the explosion of funk music out of the Midwest and the political and racial dynamics in 1970s inner city America. The film delves into the genre's influence on contemporary music, fashion, and freedom of expression, as well as its role in the rise of hip hop. The doc has firsthand stories, recollections, and experiences, as well as archival footage from the people who created and defined funk music. Nicole, thanks so much for joining 360degreesound.com.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Of course. Yeah, so I wonder if you maybe start by telling us how you got involved in We Want the Funk documentary and maybe some about your interests in funk music.
Well, I guess the first grain of this project started with the after party at Sundance where our Miles Davis film premiered. I had produced the Miles Davis film with Stanley Nelson and Firelight Films. And our co-producer at the time was really interested in having another project, going. And the after party was full of funk music, and Stanley came up with that one word pitch, funk. And we ended up not doing with that co-producer, but the idea stayed alive and ITVS came on board, and here we are 5 years later.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, it's a fascinating film. Early on in the documentary, people try to define funk music, and one commentator says, you know it when you hear it. How would you define funk?
I completely ascribe that was Todd Boyd in our film. And there's so many things that can overlap with funk music. It's like, oh, for a lot of time, for a lot of people, disco sounds very much like funk, or just rock music can even sound like funk to a degree. So to me, it's I subscribe very much to that. I know I don't maybe I don't know what it is, but I know what it isn't.
Like that. Um, so I think James Brown is widely considered to be the inventor of funk. I was wondering if he ever said in interviews like what inspired him. Like, did he say in maybe the archival footage you reviewed, like what it was that kind of funk came from, how he came up with it?
A lot of people try to pin the beginnings of funk with like Cold Sweat, things like that. But there are, of course, artists making funky music before that. I don't know if you could really pinpoint a moment or a song or a person specifically, even, but obviously James Brown was that progenitor that really caught people's ears and allowed the music to spread the way that it did.
Yeah, I have read this and debate over like what's the first funk song, and I think Papa's Got a Brand New Bag is thrown out as well. But probably same with like the first rock and roll song. It's kind of hard to just
I mean,
pick one, it's not like it just came out of nowhere. So
I think it's one of those things that you'll forever be debated. And, somebody's going to bring up, oh, there's this unheard artist that nobody knew about. And I
yeah,
can prove that
right.
it's just something that I think it's fun to debate. And it's obviously it's fun to research. But, what we do know is that James Brown was pushing this music, this sound, and the concepts of it more than anyone else.
For sure. Um, yeah, funk music is thought of as dance music, but as the film shows, there were political and socially conscious funk songs. I guess James Brown and Black and I'm Proud being one example. Talk some about the importance of showing the political and social impact of funk.
And I think it's funny because, some people were it's like, oh, you know, there's a lot of people who, eschew the idea that politics and music have an influence on on each other. But I think with funk, especially, there's no denying it. There's no separating the two. And I think you can't understand the music and how it emerged and the way it emerged without looking at the what's happening at the time. It's very much an impression of the political movements that were happening and the feeling that Black people especially were expressing, not just in the music but in life. I don't think you can get that kind of music without what was going on, especially in the 60s.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. What was something you learned from making this film that you found particularly interesting?
Well, the story of fame was fun.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd kind of, I mean, I'd always kind of appreciated, especially like the more funky aspects of David Bowie's career, but to hear it laid out so explicitly, and it was pretty subtle in the film, but it was essentially a James Brown kind of sensibility he was putting in that in fame, and James Brown himself had said, oh, this is sounds like it could be my own song, Fame. And when you listen to it, it's really similar. And so much so that James Brown cut a track that sounds exactly like Fame.
Mhm.
And but
Yeah.
James Brownified but it sounds almost no different. So it's really amazing. So that was a nice revelation. And just the revelations of and the insider information that you're getting from musicians about how much borrowing does go on in the creation of music. It's really fascinating to me. So David Bowie's Fame becomes the part of We Want the Funk. A bar mitzvah chant becomes part of Flashlight. These collageous approaches that artists can take, just from the things that they experience in their lives and how it can come back out in the music. That's really so much interesting me as like an artistic process.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was going to say that that was one of the most interesting things to me was the George Clinton saying that bar mitzvah chat that he had heard from like sixth grade, one of his Jewish classmates, inspired the da da dee da da. And,
I mean, this Jersey,
yeah,
there's a
yeah,
lot of, and especially in like Plainfield and, where I grew up in New Jersey, there's a lot of cultures living close together. So it's like, you never know what your influences will come from.
yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I've the part about David Bowie's fame, I've seen in some other documentaries, some people saying that yeah, that when they heard that song, they actually thought it was a black artist, and yeah, it ended up being a R&B hit, and but I didn't know about Elton John's Benny and the Jets being an R&B hit. That was very interesting because yeah, I never really associated that as funk song, but it's definitely has some funky R&B sounds to
Exactly. And
it.
that came to us completely through the interview process. I'd spoken to Donnie Simpson, who mentioned that he broke that record in Detroit, on this black station, and how that became like this huge R&B hit. Because black folk love that Elton John song, but then
Hmm.
Kirk Franklin brought it up out of nowhere. So it's like,
Hmm.
oh wow, this could be, this really could be something. So we, talked to a couple of people, and we really made it into something in the film. And that's just something, you couldn't necessarily get from a book, that same way.
Hmm. For sure, yeah. The documentary touches on Afrofuturism. Tell us a little bit about that and how funk music was intertwined with it.
Oh, absolutely. I think we definitely knew we wanted to touch on Afrofuturism because funk music, more than any other genre, really embraced like this futuristic look, the space platform, silver boots, these kind of things. Marvin Gaye even had the platform boots. It was really rampant in funk music, and of course you could see it in some of like the glam rock of the 70s as well, but they weren't taking it to the level that the funk musicians were. And oftentimes, funk music has this message of journey, right? Like Fantastic Voyage. Let me take you on a trip. Let me take you higher. These kinds of things. We're always kind of calling to a kind of this idea of movement and being taken somewhere else. And I think that, we couldn't ignore that in what we were seeing. So we really tried to unpack, what's being expressed when you're talking about taking somebody on a voyage to the land of funk, and having like scholars like Thomas DeFrance and Natasha Womack really speaks to like some of the underpinning ideas of that, the idea that, we're seeing a future for ourselves that's outside of everything that we're living right now.
Mhm. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, what did you enjoy most about making the film?
I love the interviewing. I did probably about 70 to 90 70 to 85% of the interviews, somewhere in there. um, that was great. And really getting the musicians to play. You have to be kind of persuasive in a lot of ways. One, for them to get to bring their instruments, because a lot of people don't want to, feel like they're performing necessarily. But, once it's a little bit of sense of victory when you get them to play something and you see that excitement, especially when they're not even playing their own stuff. They're playing the stuff that inspired them. And you can see it on their faces and you can hear it in their playing. Christian McBride playing, those Larry Graham riffs, Marcus Miller playing the P-Funk riffs, all of that is really, it's so inspirational and just fun to experience live. And hopefully that comes across in the film.
For sure, yeah. It looked like Marcus Miller was having fun doing the slap bass, talking about Larry Graham starting that. And of course, he did that through all of his music, or a lot of it, starting at the going back to the 80s. And he was interesting in the you probably saw the Luther Vandross documentary.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was
Yeah.
in that a lot. 'Cause
Yeah, and he was in our Miles Davis film. Now, Marcus
oh,
Miller,
nice.
obviously someone that really takes you through like every genre of music you could think of. He was there for like the more fusiony aspects that Miles Davis was going through, and only to graduate into like the stuff that, like actual, quote unquote funk.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I think it's fascinating how like more funk bands came out of Ohio than anywhere. I think just in Dayton alone, you had Ohio players, Slave, Zap, Lakeside.
Yeah.
Why was Ohio such a hotspot for funk?
Yeah, they have a funk museum in Dayton as well.
Nice.
And, I think we try to get at that in the film. Of course, a lot of people would, everybody wants to rep their own city. And that, that's one of the things we kind of wanted to introduce in the film is like, oh, I think the capital is here and the
Mhm.
capital is here. But there is something about Dayton, especially in Ohio, that I think didn't happen the same way as it did in other places. Some people could posit it was almost like this funk highway because there's three cities, especially in Ohio, Dayton, Ohio, Dayton, Cleveland, and Cincinnati, that you could just kind of travel to. There's an infrastructure there. There's clubs, nightclubs, and places that you could play and kind of have your music develop. But I do think a big part of it was like the economic underpinning of that was, there were good jobs, people could have houses, but and a place to rehearse. Um, that's not happening so much the same way in New Jersey as it's happening here in Ohio, or what's so widespread. So I think that's why, especially Dayton is, I think we, and hopefully, people, it comes across in the film, why
Mhm.
that area was so much a hotbed, the arts being so well supported, at least at the time that this music was flourishing.
Mhm. Yeah, and then you had some interesting bit about Minneapolis funk, which of course Prince really helped launch. And I think of the Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis and all their the time and all, all the a very distinct funk. I guess probably less horns and more keys and synthesizers. And of course, that went on to be really big in the 80s. But I guess you kind of could trace that to Bernie Worrell and how influential he was with his synth lines and all
Yeah,
that. Yeah,
like
yeah,
like I said, if we had a book, we could trace it all really and take
yeah.
time. That's like, I think especially the Minneapolis sound, it was helped by like the emergence of technology just a few years later,
Mm.
just like even a 5, 10 year span, like the technology had changed so much to allow you to be able to kind of, do the things that like a 10, 12 piece band could do,
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah, one of my favorite lines was when I think it was Marcus Miller said that like when Bernie Worrell's playing uh the bass on the synth, like he's like, yeah, all the bass players like knew they were out of work after after that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I guess finally what do you hope the viewers will take away from We Want the Funk?
People take away. It's like this is not like an encyclopedic history of funk music. I don't even know if that's possible to do because there's so much interweaving with other genres. And I do hope I think they take away the basic principles of the funk, why we love it and why we dance to it, why it makes us feel good, and hopefully, get engaged with the music and learn more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, encourage everyone to check it out. I saw it's available on YouTube and it was all on PBS. That's a great film, super interesting. So yeah, thanks so much for talking with 360 degreesound.com. Thanks everyone for watching and stay tuned to 360degreesound.com as we continue to bring you music and music related films from all angles. Thanks, Nicole.